In 2018, a seasoned hunter vanished deep within the Smoky Mountains without a trace. For 5 years, his family lived with silence until a single trail camera snapped a grainy photo of a man in the mist standing beside a forgotten pack. What it revealed unraveled a cover-up, exposed a criminal ring, and brought home a father who was never truly lost, just hiding from something he couldn't outrun. In October 2018, Daniel Rhodes drove his old Toyota Tacoma through the winding back roads of the Great Smoky Mountains. The bed, packed with hunting gear and a cooler of sandwiches, his wife Erin had made the night before. He waved at a passing park ranger, rolled down his window to let in the crisp air, and turned onto a logging trail that led deep into the woods. It wasn't his first solo hunt, not by a long shot. Daniel had grown up in Tennessee timber, taught by his father how to read animal signs and listen for silence that meant more than sound ever could. This was supposed to be a 3-day trip track, camp, clean, return, nothing unusual. He signed in at the trailhead logbook at 6:41 a.m., made a quick note that he planned to circle Chimney Ridge, and locked his truck. The morning sun filtered through copper-colored leaves as he vanished into the woods, his orange vest just a flicker before it was swallowed whole by the trees. That was the last time anyone saw him. When Daniel didn't return by Monday, Erin tried to stay calm. Maybe he'd turned off his phone to conserve battery. Maybe he'd extended his trip to follow a promising trail. But by nightfall, with no check-in, no word, and no movement on his credit card or phone location, she called the Park Service. A search was launched by sunrise. Rangers, volunteers, canine units, even helicopters were brought in. His truck was still where he left it. His boot prints led about 4 miles down the ridge before vanishing near a rocky outcrop where the trail split. No blood, no gear, no sign of a struggle, just gone. In the months that followed, search efforts thinned. Theories took their place. Some thought he fell into one of the deep limestone sinkholes that pock the mountain floor. Others whispered about bear attacks, though no remains were ever found. Erin held on to Cody, their teenage son, as best she could, but the grief hardened between them. Daniel's case faded from headlines like fog burning off a hillside, unresolved and unsettling. The woods had taken him, it seemed, and kept whatever story he carried with him. The years after Daniel's disappearance were marked by slow erosion, not just of hope, but of the routines that once made his family feel grounded. Erin stopped packing 2 lunches. She kept Daniel's flannel shirts folded in a bin under the bed, unable to give them away but too heartbroken to wear them herself. Cody, once inseparable from his father on weekend hikes and fishing trips, withdrew almost entirely. He no longer asked to go outside, no longer asked questions. At 14, he started spending more time at his friend Jacob's house or holed up in his room sketching mountain ridge lines from memory. He never admitted it out loud, but in his drawings, his dad was always just out of frame. Every year, Erin made the drive back to the trailhead on the anniversary of his disappearance. She'd sit in the cab of the Tacoma, engine off, staring into the trees as if Daniel might step out, holding a bow and a sheepish grin. On the 3rd anniversary, she left a note under a rock near the logbook. Just 5 words. Still waiting. Still love you. She never knew if anyone ever found it. By the 5th year, the case had become a cold file, boxed up in a ranger station cabinet labeled Unresolved, Wilderness Incidents. But something shifted in the spring of 2023. Wildlife officials began a program to monitor black bear movement along Chimney Ridge using heat-triggered trail cameras. The initiative was small, barely funded, mostly handled by volunteers and researchers from the nearby university. They installed 6 cams over a 5-mile radius, each programmed to send automatic uploads when triggered. On a foggy morning in early April, one of those trail cams, mounted between 2 sycamores near an old game trail, flicked on at 6:17 a.m. The image it captured was grainy but unmistakable. A man stood partially obscured by brush, wearing a moss-covered jacket and holding something slung over his shoulder. The timestamp on the photo made Erin freeze when the ranger showed it to her later. Not just because it was the first sign of life in 5 years, but because it was the same hour Daniel had vanished almost to the minute. The photo didn't look like much at first. A faint silhouette blurred by motion, grainy enough that the figure could have been mistaken for a hunter, a hiker, even a poacher. But when Ranger Melissa Kane zoomed in and enhanced the contrast, her breath caught. The man in the image had a shoulder-length beard, wild and matted, but the shape of his face, the slope of his shoulders, even the stance, it all felt familiar. She pulled Daniel Rhodes's missing persons file from the cabinet and spread out the few photos they had on record. There was one of him with a trout, another in front of his truck. The resemblance was too close to ignore. Melissa didn't call Aaron immediately. Protocol required confirmation, and trail cam anomalies were common. Still, something about the posture, the haunting quiet of the scene, made her uneasy. She printed the image and quietly drove it to the sheriff's office, where Deputy Tim Salter took one glance and said, "That's Rhodes, or it's his ghost." When Aaron was finally brought in to view the photo, her hands trembled as she reached for the print. She didn't speak for several seconds. Then she touched the edge of the image, eyes locked on the grainy shape, and whispered that it was him. "Look at the way he's standing," she said quietly. "That's how he used to check the wind before a shot? That's him." The authorities launched a limited search that weekend, dispatching a 3-person team to the coordinates marked by the camera's GPS. Cody insisted on going, but Aaron made him stay home. He stood at the door that morning, fists clenched, watching the Rangers load their packs. The fog was already rolling thick over the hills, curling through the trees like smoke. No one expected much. Cameras picked up hikers, old moonshiners, even campers off-trail from time to time. But as the search team closed in on the location, they began to notice things. Branches freshly snapped, a tin can hanging from a branch by twine, and just beyond the creek bed, nestled behind a curtain of brush, they found something half buried in leaves. It was a hunting knife. Etched along the handle, barely visible, was the name Rhodes. The hunting knife was rusted along the blade's edge, but unmistakable. Ranger Davis turned it over in his gloved hands, brushing away damp leaves and bits of moss. The engraving was faint but visible if you tilted it just right in the light. D. Rhodes. Not just a common survival knife, but one that Aaron had given Daniel for their 10th anniversary. She'd had it engraved at the little hardware store in Gatlinburg. He'd carried it every time he stepped into the woods. That knife turning up now, 5 years later, buried miles off any main trail, turned the search from speculative to urgent. The Rangers fanned out, marking a new perimeter and photographing everything. The tin can swaying from a string above the knife wasn't random either. It was a noise trap, a makeshift alert system. Someone had rigged it so the clinking would carry through the trees if someone approached. Daniel had taught Cody to do that once during a father-son camping trip. It wasn't the kind of thing a casual hiker would know. Whoever had set it was watching that area closely. More signs emerged as the team combed through the underbrush. A worn path, narrow as a deer trail, twisted deeper into a pocket of land surrounded by cliffs and dense laurel. Twigs had been arranged deliberately over parts of the ground, almost like camouflage. Broken-off branches were leaned against one another in a way that mimicked natural growth, but the angles were too clean, too calculated. Someone had tried to keep this place hidden. Back at the station, Melissa Kane updated Aaron with the latest. Aaron sat stiff in the plastic chair, staring at the knife in a Ziploc evidence bag. She didn't cry. She didn't speak at first. Finally, she said, "He's alive. If he wasn't, that wouldn't be there. He'd never leave it behind." Cody stood in the corner of the room, his arms crossed, trying to stay composed. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. His eyes never left the knife. Search teams expanded the grid, but visibility dropped as another wave of mountain fog rolled in. Whatever had happened out there, it was clear now that Daniel hadn't simply vanished. He had survived. The question was, why hadn't he come back? The fog had settled in thick by the next morning, curling low around the trees like smoke and swallowing sound. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Ranger Davis, now leading the search team, paused every few steps, listening for the faintest crackle or snap. They'd followed the faint trail past a dry stream bed and up into a thicket where sunlight barely pierced through. And that's when they saw it, an old tarp, sun-bleached and drooping between two trees, barely visible from more than a few feet away. It wasn't much, just a makeshift lean-to, partially collapsed, with the remains of a fire ring beneath. Charred bones of branches, a melted soup can, and beside it a pair of old hiking boots so caked in mud they blended into the forest floor. But what made everyone go quiet was the notebook. Weather-stained, curled at the edges, and half buried under a rock, its first few pages were unreadable, but inside names were scribbled, times, notes. One line, written over and over again across several pages, read, "Do not go down the gulch." Melissa flipped through slowly, trying to make sense of it. There were lists of supplies, canned beans, iodine tablets, ammo. Then, further in, dates with strange codes beside them. She radioed for the sheriff to join them in the clearing and sealed the notebook in an evidence bag. Meanwhile, Erin sat by the phone at home, her heart pounding every time it rang. She hadn't slept. Cody, now almost 18, had moved into a steady rhythm of pacing from window to door to table and back again. Neither of them knew what to make of the call they'd gotten that morning. Just that a shelter had been found, and it looked like someone had been living in it for a long time. Back in the forest, Davis spotted something near the base of a tree. He knelt down, brushing moss and damp earth from a wooden crate, half buried. When they pried it open, they found ammunition, 2 sealed MREs, and a folded map. The edges were torn, but the center held a hand-drawn circle over a narrow part of the forest, and the words written in smudged pen ink chilled them. "They're watching. Stay hidden. Never go back." The map was brittle in the corners, the kind of paper that flakes when handled too roughly, but the markings were recent enough to show someone had been studying it, revising it. There were symbols drawn near water sources and steep ridges, a few X marks circled in pen, and just above the fold, one word written in uppercase block letters, "Trap." Sheriff Redland unfolded it on the hood of the patrol truck and stared for a long while, jaw clenched tight. "He wasn't just surviving," he said. "He was hiding from something." Davis nodded, then pointed to a ravine just north of Firefly Gap. "That's where the other trail cam picked up the heat signature. The ridge near it lines up with the circle on this map. I think he was trying to guide someone to it, or away from it." Meanwhile, back at the station, Erin held the map between trembling fingers. Her eyes moved over each mark, each curve of the mountains she once hiked with Daniel in their 20s. She recognized one of the X spots. It was a lookout near Twin Forks where Daniel had proposed to her in 1999. "This isn't random," she said softly. "That's where he'd go to feel safe." Cody leaned over her shoulder, pointing to the word scrawled beside a gully. Why would Dad write trap unless he meant it? Who would be setting traps way out here? He was asking the questions that now everyone else was too afraid to voice. That afternoon, Davis and a small team of rangers moved into the area circled on the map. It was slow going. Thickets closed in tight, and the fog seemed to hang lower, heavier than the day before. About an hour in, they came across a strange pile of stones stacked deliberately in the shape of a triangle. Not natural. Each stone had been scraped, marked with faint red lines, like symbols someone had tried to erase but never fully could. Melissa took photos, bagged a few smaller rocks for testing. Then came the trail cam. Nestled high in a pine, angled directly toward a narrow game trail. It wasn't theirs, it hadn't been installed by the park, and worse yet, it was live. Someone had been watching that path. Maybe still was. The trail cam they found wasn't one of the cheap models sold at the local sporting goods store. It was high-end, military-grade, complete with a thermal sensor, motion detection, and a satellite uplink. Melissa examined the casing, brushing away dirt and pine debris. "This thing's been transmitting," she muttered, her voice low and unnerved. "Someone's watching, and not from anywhere nearby." They didn't say it aloud, but everyone felt it. The woods no longer felt like neutral ground. This wasn't about a missing hunter anymore. This was something bigger, deeper, and more deliberate than anyone had guessed. Sheriff Redland radioed for a full sweep and told dispatch to contact federal agencies. Something about this wasn't sitting right with him, and after 30 years in law enforcement, he'd learned to trust that kind of unease. Further down the trail, Davis spotted what looked like a hunting blind, but it was wrong in every way. It was expertly camouflaged, its supports embedded in thick brush, its interior reinforced with metal sheeting. Inside, they found a stack of sealed rations, night vision goggles, a logbook, and a rifle with a serial number filed off. This wasn't just a hideout, it was a station, a place built for long-term surveillance or escape, not for game watching or camping. Back at the station, Aaron sat with the map again, eyes locked on the red X near the ridge. Cody paced nearby, his frustration rising. This isn't just about Dad going missing. Someone made sure he stayed gone. Aaron nodded, but her eyes didn't leave the paper. Or maybe he found something, and they made sure he couldn't talk about it. That night, Redland stayed late in his office, rewatching the trail cam footage frame by frame. At 3:41 a.m. Just 2 days before they retrieved it, a figure stepped into the view, blurry, half-shrouded in fog, wearing a torn flannel shirt and carrying a pack that matched the one Daniel had owned. The man looked directly at the camera, then pointed into the forest behind him. A slow, deliberate gesture. Not a warning, a signal. Redland paused the footage. His hand hovered over the mouse, then reached for the phone. "Get me the FBI field office," he said quietly. "Now." In the quiet hum of early morning, Erin stood on the porch of her father's cabin, watching as fog rolled through the treetops like slow-moving smoke. She hadn't slept. None of them had. The image from the trail cam had spread through town like wildfire, faster than Redland could contain it. Everyone had an opinion, a theory, a story they suddenly remembered from 5 years ago. But Erin wasn't interested in gossip. She was interested in the direction the man had pointed. That morning, with Cody at her side and Redland reluctantly agreeing to stay behind to manage the growing media circus, they set off toward the far ridge. It was the same area where Daniel had told them he once found an abandoned moonshine, still decades ago, back when he was younger and bolder and chasing game through unmarked hollows. The path wasn't marked on any official map, but Daniel had drawn it once in a notebook Erin found buried in the garage. It led deep into a section of forest known locally as Black Hollow. Most locals avoided it. Stories said it was cursed land, unsettled and dangerous after dark. As they hiked, the terrain shifted. The air got cooler, heavier, and the underbrush thickened until sunlight barely reached the ground. They found strange signs along the way: charred wood, an old boot heel embedded in moss, and finally a strip of fabric caught on a bramble. It was red plaid, faded and frayed, and Erin's voice caught in her throat. It was from her father's flannel shirt. They pressed on, and just as the sun crested above the ridge, they saw it, a clearing carved unnaturally into the dense forest. At the center stood a rusted structure, almost bunker-like, half sunken into the hillside and camouflaged with vines and soil. The door was steel, dented but intact, and sealed with a padlock that had long since rusted shut. Cody glanced at Erin, his voice hushed. "This isn't some hunting hideaway. This is a fallout shelter." Erin nodded slowly, heart pounding as she stepped forward and ran her hand across the cold, pitted metal. "Or it's a prison," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Either way, something or someone had been down there. The padlock came off easier than expected. With one solid strike from Cody's hatchet, the corroded metal snapped free and clattered to the ground, sending a sharp echo through the otherwise silent clearing. Erin hesitated at the threshold. The door had swollen with moisture and age, groaning on its hinges as they forced it open, revealing a blackness so absolute it swallowed the light. The air that spilled out was cold and stale, tinged with something faintly metallic and long decayed. They exchanged a glance before stepping inside, flashlights flickering against concrete walls stained with time and moss. The structure wasn't large, but it stretched deeper than expected. It was more than just a shelter, it was a place someone had lived. A cot sat against the far wall, rusted and collapsed in one corner. Beside it, a crate held cans of food, all expired years ago, and a mason jar with what looked like handwritten notes stuffed inside. As Erin reached for it, her fingers brushed a worn photograph tucked beneath the jar. She turned it over in the beam of her flashlight and stopped breathing. It was her father, unmistakable in his green hunting vest, sitting outside a cabin she'd never seen before, smiling faintly as though caught off guard. In the corner of the photo was a date, scribbled in red pen, 4 months after he'd disappeared. Cody crouched near the back, where a stack of books had half melted from damp, their pages curling like leaves in a fire. "He was here," Cody said softly, brushing dirt off what looked like a survival manual. "He lived in here. For a while." "But why wouldn't he come home?" Erin whispered, staring at the image in her hands. "He had gear, he had food, he was alive. And he knew we were looking for him." She opened the mason jar and began pulling out the notes. They were journal entries, written in her father's shaky but familiar script. The first page read, "If someone finds this, I didn't choose this. I was led here, and I was told not to leave. Not yet." Erin sat down, her flashlight trembling in her grip. Whatever had happened to her father, it hadn't been a simple accident. He'd been alive, yes, but not free. The forest was silent as they emerged from the old shelter, daylight spilling through the trees in narrow golden shafts that cut through the morning mist. Erin clutched the photo and the jar of notes to her chest, her pulse drumming with a strange mix of awe and dread. Something had shifted. For 5 years, her father had been a memory wrapped in questions. Now, those questions were multiplying. Cody walked a few steps ahead, quiet, scanning the trail as though expecting someone or something to be watching. Back at camp, they spread the contents of the jar on a plastic tarp. The pages were yellowed and smudged, some ink bleeding from water damage, but still legible. The first few entries were survival logs, hunting notes, dates of rainfall, observations on animal movement. Then came a sharp turn. A single entry marked with a shaky hand read, "They come at dusk. Not every night, but when the air turns still and the birds go quiet, I can hear them just beyond the tree line." Erin's eyes lifted from the page, locking with Cody's. He hadn't said anything, but she could see it in his expression. He felt it too. The sense that this was no longer a missing persons case, it was something deeper. More entries followed, cryptic and unsettling. "Saw a woman in white by the creek again. She doesn't speak, just stares. If I move toward her, she vanishes." Then another. "I buried the camera after the last one came too close. Didn't want it finding the film. If they know I'm documenting them, I won't make it to spring." The next page had only a rough sketch, something hunched, with antlers, long arms, and eyes that glowed in the dark. "He was seeing things," Cody said carefully, trying to ground the moment. "Isolation messes with your head." But Erin wasn't convinced. Her father was a rational man, a hunter, someone who knew how to track, survive, and read the land. These weren't the ramblings of a man losing his grip. They were warnings, recorded by someone who truly believed he wasn't alone in those woods. She turned to Cody and said, quietly but firmly, "We need to find that buried camera. Whatever he saw, it's on film." They started with the map her father had sketched in the margins of his notebook, a crude drawing of trees, a creek, and a strange X near what looked like a bend in the trail. Erin and Cody retraced the steps from the shelter, counting paces, scanning for anything that matched the drawing. The forest was dense, overgrown with vines and fallen limbs, but Erin kept moving forward with purpose. She knew they were close. Her father had left that marker for someone to find, and she was determined to be the one to do it. It was Cody who spotted the small stack of flat stones, almost too perfectly shaped to be natural. Beneath them, the dirt looked recently disturbed compared to the surrounding earth, softer and darker. They began digging with their hands, brushing away layers of soil until Erin's fingers struck something hard and metallic. She pulled back, heart pounding. Slowly, she unearthed an old, rusted film canister wrapped in a plastic bag. The outer layer was cracked, but the inner roll seemed intact. Back at the ranger's cabin, where they'd set up a temporary station, Cody dug out a portable film scanner from his gear. They worked in silence, hearts racing, watching as each image loaded onto the laptop. The first few were standard wilderness shots, deer trails, thick brush, low-light campfires. Then came a shot that made Erin's breath catch in her throat. It was a photo of her father, eyes wide, kneeling in front of the camera with his finger pressed to his lips. Behind him, half obscured in the trees, was a shape tall, gaunt, and indistinct, but unmistakably human-like. The next photo was closer. The shape had moved. Now it stood at the edge of the clearing, its outline sharpened just enough to reveal details. Matted fur, what looked like a hollow face, and those same wide, luminous eyes sketched in the journal. Cody stared at the screen, jaw tight. "This isn't a bear," he muttered. This is something else." Erin didn't speak. Her father's last entries weren't delusions, they were warnings. And now, after all this time, she had proof that whatever had stalked him in the Smoky Mountains hadn't been a figment of fear. It had been real. Erin sat motionless in front of the laptop as the next photo loaded. The image was blurry but unmistakable. Her father was crouched behind a fallen log, his face streaked with dirt and fear, eyes darting toward the dense trees behind him. His camouflage jacket was torn, and one boot appeared to be missing. The timestamp in the corner read June 18, 2023 days after he was last seen. Erin's breath hitched. He had survived longer than anyone thought. He had been alive and moving through the forest, alone and hunted. Cody leaned in closer, studying the grainy backdrop behind her father's shape. "Look there," he whispered, pointing to a shadow between two trees. "It's watching him." Erin followed his gaze. The shape was barely visible, but it stood taller than any man and looked like it was leaning forward, limbs too long, the posture unnatural. Her father hadn't just been lost, he'd been pursued. The trail cam photos continued, each one documenting a sequence of desperate survival. In one, her father had constructed a crude shelter out of pine branches and rocks. In another, he appeared to be signaling toward the camera with his arms, forming shapes that resembled letters, an attempt at communication, maybe even a call for help. The last image hit Erin the hardest. He was sitting by a creek, shoulders slumped, head down, the long shadow of something lurking just beyond the clearing, stretching toward him. That photo was dated July 4, 2 weeks after his disappearance had officially been declared a cold case. Erin closed the laptop and sat back, her hands trembling. "He knew they'd find this," she said quietly. "He left this trail for someone to follow. He wanted to be found, even if it was too late." Cody nodded, but his expression was clouded with unease. Whatever was following him, it might still be out there. Erin looked toward the darkened woods beyond the cabin window, the air thick with silence. They hadn't just uncovered evidence of a man's final days, they had stumbled into something far older, something that moved unseen through the forest. And whatever it was still watching. The next morning brought an eerie hush to the forest. Even the birds seemed reluctant to break the silence, as if they too sensed the weight of what had been uncovered. Erin and Cody set out at first light, guided by the GPS coordinates embedded in the trail cam metadata. The terrain was rough, the narrow path overgrown with brambles and fallen limbs, untouched in years. Every step forward felt like they were moving deeper into her father's final moments. As they neared the area from the last photograph, Erin's pace slowed, her eyes scanning the forest with a cautious reverence. They reached the creek by midday. Time had worn down the stones, and moss clung to every surface, but the shape of the area matched the image exactly. Erin stood where her father had once sat, her boots inches from where he had left the print of his own. "He was right here," she murmured. "This is where he waited." Cody crouched nearby, brushing aside leaves and loose dirt. "Look at this," he said, revealing a small stack of rocks deliberately arranged in a triangular pattern. Beneath it, half buried in the mud, was a folded piece of cloth. Erin knelt and gently pulled it free. It was part of her father's jacket, the initials E.W., still faintly stitched near the collar. Tucked inside was a laminated map, weather-worn but legible. Her father had marked it with a red pen, circling a spot deep within the woods and scribbling a single word beside it: safe. The breath caught in her throat. He'd found something or somewhere he believed could protect him, or maybe it was a place he wanted them to look, a final message hidden in the brush. Cody scanned the tree line with renewed urgency. "If he made it there, we need to go." Erin nodded, folding the map with shaking hands. She had come looking for closure, but now she had something else entirely: a lead. It wasn't just the last place her father had been. It might be where he had gone willingly, for reasons only he understood. The wind stirred through the trees like a whisper, and for the first time, Erin felt like he was leading them still. The marked spot on the map sat another 2 miles east, deeper into a part of the forest that hadn't seen foot traffic in years. Erin and Cody pushed forward, the afternoon sun flickering through the canopy in broken shafts of light. Every rustle in the underbrush made them freeze, not out of fear, but out of reverence for what they might find. This wasn't just another hike. It was a retracing of one man's final journey, a trail of intentions, fear, and survival. The weight of that truth settled heavily with each step. As they entered a narrow ravine, the forest seemed to close in tighter. The air cooled, and the path became harder to follow, more instinct than visible trail. Erin stopped, examining a tree with strange notches in the bark. They formed a pattern, subtle but deliberate 3 vertical marks, 1 horizontal. Cody pointed out another set 30 feet ahead on a pine trunk. "Trail markers, old ones," he said. Erin nodded. Her father had left a path, not for himself, but for someone to follow. Her. They moved carefully, eyes scanning bark and stone. After nearly an hour, the forest gave way to a moss-covered clearing, silent except for the hush of wind through the branches. In its center stood a small rock outcropping, partially hidden by undergrowth. Behind it, nestled beneath a leaning elm, was the mouth of a low-set cave. Erin's heart thundered in her chest. She turned slowly to Cody. "He came here. He marked it. This is what he wanted us to find." The entrance was narrow but passable. Cody went in first, his flashlight casting long shadows across the walls. Erin followed, each step stirring the stale, earthen air. Just a few feet in, they saw signs of habitation: a makeshift bed of pine needles, a weathered thermos, and an old hiking pack, torn but unmistakably hers from childhood. She reached for it with trembling hands and sat down beside it, silent. Her father hadn't vanished without a trace. He'd gone somewhere to survive, or to disappear for reasons that still lay buried in silence. Whatever had driven him here, he had left just enough behind for her to follow. The cave was deeper than they expected, curving inward into a kind of alcove where the light from Cody's flashlight illuminated the faint outlines of a life paused mid-motion. A blackened tin cup sat beside a stack of newspaper pages, brittle with age. A tattered wool blanket, stiff with time and weather, was bunched in the corner. It was more than just a place to rest. It had been a refuge. Erin crouched near the wall, where faint scrawlings marked the rock, faded but legible. Dates, short phrases. One read, "Day 13, no sign, holding out." Another simply said, "Erin, stay strong." Her hand went to her mouth, stifling a sob that came up hard and sudden. Cody sat beside her in silence, letting her take it in. The air felt charged with something sacred. This was where her father had made his stand against the cold, the elements, and whatever drove him into this isolation. It wasn't a story of getting lost. It was a choice, a forced decision maybe, but a deliberate one. He hadn't vanished into the mountains. He'd retreated into them, leaving behind a thread of clues for a daughter he hoped might someday find her way back to him, or at least understand why he left. They searched the space methodically. In the far corner, Cody's flashlight caught the glint of metal tucked beneath a loose pile of stones. He moved the rocks gently and pulled out a small, rusted ammo box. Erin opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were photos, old ones. A family camping trip, her 8th birthday at the lake. A newspaper clipping about a missing local man, dated just weeks before her father disappeared. Beneath those lay a weathered notebook, its cover cracked. Erin flipped it open to the first page. "If you're reading this, I owe you the truth." Her breath caught. The mystery that had haunted 5 years of birthdays, holidays, and sleepless nights was no longer a void. It had a voice. Her father hadn't just disappeared, he had left behind a story, one hidden in stone, shadow, and silence. Now, finally, that story was ready to be told. The descent from the cave was slow, not just because of the terrain, but because of the weight that now accompanied every step. Erin gripped her father's notebook tightly, her other hand brushing against the rock wall to steady herself. Cody led the way, flashlight sweeping across patches of moss and fallen leaves, but neither of them spoke much. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was reverent, the kind that hangs in the air after a truth too large to fully absorb settles over everything. At the bottom of the slope, the mist had lifted just enough to reveal the faint trail they'd followed earlier. The woods, while still dense and humming with cicadas, no longer felt so oppressive. Erin glanced back once, eyes lingering on the direction of the cave, then turned away. "Do you think anyone else knows about that place?" she asked quietly. Cody shrugged, keeping his voice low. "If they did, they didn't come for the right reasons, and they didn't leave anything like that behind." When they finally returned to Cody's truck, the sun had dipped behind the peaks, casting a pale lavender hue across the tree line. Erin placed the notebook carefully in her backpack, as if it were a sacred text. She hadn't decided what to do with it yet, whether to share it publicly or keep it within the family. But either way, it was hers now. A record of her father's final thoughts, his fears, and above all, his love. As Cody started the engine, Erin looked out across the Smoky Mountains, their dark ridges layered against the sky like secrets still waiting to be told. Her father had vanished into these woods, not as a lost man, but as one making a final, desperate decision. And after all these years, a single photo from a trail camera had unraveled the thread that led to his truth. She wasn't ready to leave the mountains just yet. There were still unanswered questions about the poaching ring he had written about the man who had watched him, but tonight wasn't about that. Tonight was for him, for the man who gave everything to protect the ones he loved. The next morning brought a sky washed clean by night rains, the kind of blue that only came after a storm. Erin sat on the tailgate of Cody's truck, a paper cup of gas station coffee growing cold in her hand. The notebook lay open on her lap, pages fluttering in the soft breeze like the wings of a bird finally freed from its cage. She had read through every entry twice now, some sections more than that, and still she couldn't fully absorb it. Her father hadn't died quickly. He hadn't gotten lost, at least not in the way they all feared. He had been hiding, watching, surviving. Cody stood nearby, speaking quietly on the phone with a park official. From his posture and tone, Erin could tell the conversation was serious. When he hung up, he looked at her and nodded slightly, eyes heavy with meaning. "They're sending someone out," he said, "to secure the cave, and probably to look into some of what your dad wrote." Erin just nodded, unsure whether she felt vindicated or overwhelmed. Maybe both. The last few pages of the notebook were the hardest. Her father's handwriting grew shakier, words more spaced out. There was pain in those lines, not just physical, but emotional. Regret, resignation. A quiet sort of hope that someday someone might find him, understand why he did what he did, and carry the truth forward. She reached the final page again, her eyes lingering on the last sentence. "If you're reading this, Then maybe the mountain finally gave me back. Aaron swallowed hard. It felt like he was talking directly to her, not as a hunter or a missing person, but simply as her dad. The man who used to braid her pigtails and tuck notes into her lunchbox. The man who always promised to keep her safe, even when he wasn't sure how. Cody climbed into the driver's seat and glanced over. "You ready?" Aaron hesitated, then closed the notebook and held it close. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Let's go home." As the truck pulled away from the overlook, the Smoky Mountains stood behind them, ancient and unmoved, their secrets still buried deep in mist and pine. But one secret, at least, had finally seen the light. The air inside the cave was cooler than Aaron expected, a quiet stillness pressing in from all sides. Her flashlight beam swept across the rough stone walls, picking up flecks of quartz and the occasional scurry of life that had made this place home long after her father had disappeared. The silence was broken only by the crunch of their boots on damp gravel as she and Cody moved deeper in. They didn't speak. Words felt too big, too heavy. This wasn't the place for conversation. It was a space for listening, for uncovering the parts of a man that had long been buried, not by dirt, but by time and misunderstanding. The notebook had mentioned a secondary chamber, a hollow behind a collapsed shelf of stone. It took some maneuvering, but eventually they squeezed through a narrow gap and found it. A crude bedroll still lay in one corner, rotted through with age, and a tin cup sat atop a flat rock, as if waiting for its owner to return. But it was the wall across from them that made Aaron stop cold. There, etched directly into the stone with the tip of a knife, were a series of markings, dates, initials, and beneath them a single sentence carved with more care than anything else. "I made it this far." She reached out to touch the grooves, fingers trembling, the weight of it all settling into her chest like a stone. Her father had survived, longer than anyone had guessed. Long enough to leave a record, a message. Cody took a step closer, holding his flashlight steady as she ran her hand over the inscription. "He was here," she said softly, not really to him but to the air, to the memory, to the man whose voice now echoed in her mind like wind through the trees. They didn't stay long after that. Some places aren't meant to be lingered in. They're meant to be found, honored, and then left to rest. As they emerged from the cave into the overcast light of day, Aaron paused and looked back. The entrance was barely visible, swallowed by ivy and time. Still, something told her her father had wanted to be found, not just his body, but his truth. And now, finally, he had been. They sat by the stream where the trail curved just below the cave, listening to the steady rush of water over smoothed stones, letting the quiet settle after everything they had just discovered. Aaron hadn't cried in years, not really, but now tears traced clean lines down her dirt-smudged face as she stared into the woods. She clutched her father's journal to her chest, the leather cover warm from her body, and she could still smell the faintest scent of smoke clinging to the pages. Cody sat nearby, elbows on his knees, eyes scanning the trees, but not really seeing them. They both knew something had shifted, something vital. Her father's death was no longer a mystery. It was a story, one that finally had a shape, a beginning, and an end. In the journal's final pages, her father had written about the injury, the slow failure of his body, and the decision not to try to crawl back down the ridge. He'd known his chances were slim, but there was no bitterness in his words. Instead, he wrote about the beauty of the silence, the colors of the sky at dusk, and the sense of peace that came from knowing he had lived fully, even if the end was lonely. "I don't want anyone to blame the mountain," one line read. "She didn't take me. She held me." That sentence alone undid Aaron all over again. Later, back at the ranger station, she handed over the journal and trail cam photo with steady hands. The deputy's expression changed when he saw them, shifting from polite curiosity to something quieter, more respectful. They would send a team to retrieve what remained near the cave. But Aaron didn't need to be there for that. She had already said goodbye. Outside the station, the clouds had finally broken, and afternoon sunlight cut down through the canopy in golden shafts. Cody offered to drive her back into town, but she shook her head. "I think I'll walk," she said. He didn't argue. As she stepped onto the path that led through the trees, she glanced back once, then moved forward, the sound of birdsong rising above her, the forest no longer heavy with unanswered questions. The recovery team moved slowly, mindful of both the rugged terrain and the reverence owed to what they were about to find. Just below the mouth of the cave, nestled between two large boulders and shielded by decades of fallen pine needles and brush, they found what remained of Daniel Lang. His boots were still upright, toes pointed toward the stream, as if he had been seated there, waiting for the morning sun. Time had hollowed him out, but the bones told the story clearly. No trauma, no violence, just stillness and nature and the quiet acceptance of fate. Beside him was the rusted metal of his hunting rifle, a cracked thermos, and, remarkably, the waterproof pouch that had preserved his journal. Word traveled quickly through the Smokies. Local news stations ran quiet segments about the discovery, featuring archival photos of Daniel with his daughter Erin, both in blaze-orange vests and wind-burned cheeks, always smiling at the camera. The trail cam photo, grainy but undeniable, was shown again and again. It depicted a figure sitting by the rocks, facing the stream, nearly overtaken by shadow, but with a posture unmistakably human. It wasn't eerie. If anything, it was peaceful. Erin returned a few weeks later, not to stand where he had died, but to revisit where he had lived. She walked through the old cabin outside Cades Cove, now silent but preserved exactly how he left it. A map still pinned to the wall showed a red circle around the ridge where he'd vanished. Above it, a note in her father's handwriting read, "One last run." She didn't take it down. Instead, she folded the journal pages, sealed them in a shadow box, and left it on the shelf above the hearth. Later that evening, she sat at the edge of a small overlook, legs dangling, as the wind rustled the pines behind her. Cody sat beside her, silent as always, a steady presence. Erin didn't speak, not yet. She just watched the layers of the Smokies stretch out in the fading light, soft and endless. Her father had never truly left these hills. He had simply become part of them. And for the first time in 5 long years, that thought didn't ache. It comforted. The sun hadn't fully crested the ridgeline when the search team, guided by Erin and Cody, reached the narrow deer trail leading toward the shadowed edge of the gorge. It was colder here, the thick trees blocking most of the morning light, and the air smelled faintly of wet leaves and old bark. Cody pointed to the narrow outcrop ahead where the camera had been found. Just below it, the trail cam had captured the blurred image of what looked like a man seated among the rocks, his form half lost in fog. But the positioning and the small reflective shape at his side, the unmistakable glint of a metal thermos, had left no doubt. Erin crouched by the mossy slope where the path dropped off into a rocky shelf. Her breath caught as she spotted the faintest impression of disturbed soil and something pale tucked beneath the roots of a leaning tree. It was a corner of faded canvas, frayed and brittle. She brushed back the debris, and there, nestled against the roots, was a weathered backpack. The zipper had long rusted, but inside were fragments of a map, a cracked compass, and a tightly rolled journal wrapped in waxed paper. The team moved carefully from that point on, using soft voices and slow, deliberate steps. Not far from the backpack, tucked beneath an overhang just out of sight, they found what they had come for. The remains were positioned against the rock, seated upright, leaning slightly to the right, as if Daniel Lang had sat down to rest and simply never moved again. His coat was still mostly intact, stretched across his shoulders, and his boots were still laced, scuffed, but upright. There was no sign of trauma, no indication of foul play, just a quiet end in the silence of the mountain. Erin knelt beside the spot, her fingers trembling as she reached for the waxed paper-wrapped journal. She didn't open it there. She just held it close, pressed to her chest like something sacred. Cody stood a few feet away, his head bowed, hands in his pockets. Neither of them spoke. The forest didn't demand words, only stillness. And after 5 long years of searching, of waiting and wondering, the mountain had finally given back its answer. The climb to the overhang was treacherous, a steep and narrow path lined with jagged stones and slick moss that hadn't seen much sunlight in years. The search team moved slowly, their boots pressing into soil that had held its secrets tight since the day Daniel Lang vanished. Erin stayed near the front, her hand never straying far from her jacket pocket, where she'd tucked the last letter he wrote her. It had grown soft around the edges from being read and reread over the years. Now she hoped it might guide her to where he had last stood. The wind shifted near the ridge, sweeping through the spruce and fir, carrying with it a faint metallic scent. One of the volunteers paused, eyes narrowing at the slope just below a rock ledge. There, hidden by time and forest growth, was a worn-out thermal vest, the kind Daniel always wore when he went deep into the mountains. Half covered in leaves and pinned beneath a fallen branch, it was almost camouflaged by nature. Erin stepped forward, kneeling beside it with quiet reverence. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the vest, revealing a small, dented trail thermos still latched to the strap. Its painted surface had chipped away, but her father's initials, DL, were still faintly visible. They fanned out from there, brushing aside debris, checking for more signs. Within minutes, someone called out from beneath a craggy outcropping shaded by two leaning pines. Tucked beneath the natural shelter was the outline of a campfire ring, long cold. Next to it lay an aged roll of canvas, heavy with moisture and time. Erin crouched down again, carefully unrolling the bundle. Inside was a rusted knife, a hand-drawn map of the surrounding ridgelines, and what appeared to be several pages torn from a journal, bound with twine. She didn't open them, not yet. She just stared at them, as if afraid they'd dissolve if touched too soon. Cody placed a hand gently on her shoulder, grounding her. For the first time in years, she wasn't chasing rumors or scattered leads. The mountain was speaking, softly, finally, and after all this time, it was telling the truth. The coroner's office handled the recovery with care, packaging Daniel Lang's remains and personal effects with quiet professionalism. It was a somber procession down the mountain, each member of the search team walking with a kind of reverent stillness, boots crunching on the pine-needled path as fog drifted through the trees like ghostly smoke. Erin followed close behind, carrying the waxed bundle of journal pages she hadn't yet dared to read. She felt an odd peace in her chest. Not the relief she had imagined for 5 long years, but something quieter, more grounded. She knew now not just where her father had gone, but that he hadn't suffered alone in some cruel way. He had made a final camp, wrapped himself in what warmth he could find, and waited. Back in town, the news spread quickly. Daniel Lang had become a quiet legend in the Smokies, the experienced hunter who had vanished without a trace. His return, even as bones and memory, carried weight. At the local diner, old-timers spoke in hushed tones over black coffee, some recalling how they had joined the first days of the search, others just nodding solemnly. But for Erin, it wasn't about town closure or solving a mystery. It was about reclaiming something that had been lost, not just a father, but a story that finally had an ending. She waited until the third night to open the journal pages. The handwriting was faint in places, warped by moisture and time, but it was his. Daniel had written about the weather turning, about a twisted ankle and dwindling supplies. He had known help wouldn't come quickly. But most of the entries weren't about fear or pain, they were about Erin. Memories of their hikes, jokes they'd shared, lessons he'd passed down without knowing he was doing so. On the final page, his words trailed off mid-sentence, but not before one last line that read, "I hope she keeps walking. That's what we do." Erin read it 3 times before closing the bundle and pressing it gently to her chest. The ache didn't vanish, but it softened. She stepped outside, the mountain air crisp against her face, and in that stillness she knew she would carry him forward with every step. Of all the places Erin thought she'd end up, standing on a sun-dappled overlook with the morning mist curling through the treetops hadn't been one of them. But that was where she found herself, 5 months after they'd brought her father down from the mountains. She stood alone, a framed photo of Daniel in one hand and a small brass tin in the other. The air carried the scent of pine and early autumn, crisp and clean, the kind of air her father had always said could clear your soul. She knelt at the edge of a flat stone outcrop and opened the tin, scattering his ashes into the wind. The breeze caught them gently, lifting them up before they disappeared into the fog below. Behind her, a new trail marker stood embedded into the rock, carved by hand and mounted on a piece of cedar. It read Lang's Lookout, and beneath it, a small engraving, "Keep walking." It had been Cody's idea, but the entire search crew had pitched in to build the path that now wound gently through the forest up to the ridge. For years, that stretch of wild had felt like a boundary dangerous, haunted by an unanswered question. Now it had become a place of memory, a place where silence didn't hurt so much anymore. Back in town, life moved on. The diner still opened before dawn, the ranger station still fielded calls about lost hikers and bear sightings. But something in the air had shifted. People didn't speak of Daniel Lang in hushed tones anymore. His story had become part of the mountain's fabric, stitched into the trails and echoed in the rustle of leaves overhead. Erin started volunteering with the search and rescue team that fall, her pack always ready by the door, boots broken in, compass clipped to her belt. She knew now what it meant to keep walking not blindly, but with purpose. Late one evening, she pulled out her father's journal again, fingers tracing the worn edges of the last page. Then she added her own note beneath it. Not an ending, just a continuation. Found you. Thank you for waiting. She closed the book, laced her boots, and stepped back into the woods.